The cell smelled of nothing. That was the wrongest thing about it. Sevhel had been in holds before, slave pits on the Frankish coast, the bilge of a longship where captives fouled themselves in the dark, the stone rooms under Hattori where men waited to be sold. Those places smelled of fear and filth and bodies. This place smelled of nothing at all. The air moved through vents he couldn't see, recycled and scrubbed and pushed back in, and it tasted like breathing inside a dead man's mouth, just empty. He had been here long enough to stop counting the feeding cycles and start counting the mechanisms. The light never changed, sodium orange, flat as old copper, bolted behind panels in the ceiling that he couldn't reach even at full stretch. The floor was a composite he didn't have a word for. It gave slightly under his weight and never got warm. The walls were the same, gray, smooth, identical to every wall he'd seen since the light had taken him off the beach. He did not think about the beach, not yet, not until there was room to think about it and a throat to put his hands around afterward. The door was built well. He'd known that the first time he hit it, open palm testing, the way you test the face of a cliff before you climbed it. The impact rang flat and dead, no flex. The material was dense and layered, and whatever they'd used for the locking mechanism was seated deep in the door's body where fingers couldn't reach it. He'd spent 3 feeding cycles on the door itself before he understood that the door was irrelevant. The door was built well. All the wrong things were built well. The mount was where things failed. He crouched at the base of the frame now, one hand flat against the housing where the door met the wall. His fingers traced the seam by touch, because the light in here made everything the same flat orange. The housing was a bracket, wide as his palm, bolted into the wall composite at 4 points. The bracket held, the bolts held, but the composite itself, the wall material where the bolts were seated, had a grain to it, more like the way river ice cracked, along lines of stress that the ice didn't know it had, until weight found them. He had been a raider for 9 seasons. Before that, a shipwright's second son. He knew joints. Every ship was joints, the keel to the ribs to the strakes to each other. A ship failed where timber met timber, where the thing you built touched the thing it was built onto. This wall was a ship that had never been tested by sea. He pressed, exploratory. The composite under the lower bolt gave a creak so faint he felt it through his fingertips more than heard it. He shifted his weight, found the angle where the grain ran, and pressed again. The creak became a whisper. The wall around the bolt would give. Whoever had built this cell had built the door to hold against what pushed from the inside, and they'd built the lock to resist what pulled from the outside, but they'd built the housing mount into a wall that was meant to be adequate. A wall built by someone who had done this 1,000 times and never needed it to be more than adequate. Sevhel understood adequate. He'd killed men who fought adequately. He settled his shoulder against the mount point, breathed out, and began. The slaver made his rounds the way a farmer checked fence posts, without urgency, without affection, with the mechanical attention of someone who had done the task so many times it had worn a groove in his bones. Sevhel heard him coming before he saw him. The footsteps were wrong, too many joints, a clicking gait like a dog walking on a frozen lake. Then the shadow passed the narrow slit in his cell door, and he saw the shape, taller than a man by a head, narrower in the shoulders, with a face like a collection of flat planes that refused to resolve into a face. The slaver carried a device in one hand, thin, rectangular, glowing with the same dead orange as everything else on this ship. The slaver paused at Sevhel's door, a brief pause, the length of a breath, maybe 2. The device in his hand pulsed once, and Sevhel saw the readout change. Numbers or symbols he couldn't read, but something on the display shifted color, from orange to a sharp blue-white that didn't belong on this ship, an off note in a song made entirely of one flat tone. The slaver's head tilted. That collection of planes rearranged itself into what might have been attention. Then the device pulsed again. The display settled back to orange, and the slaver moved on. As clicking gait faded down the corridor, even and unhurried. A fence post had looked slightly odd. The farmer had noted it. The farmer had not stopped to dig it up. Sevhel watched the shadow go and filed the paws away in the part of his mind where he kept the things that would matter later. Then he went back to the mount, the housing sheared on the seventh sustained push, a structural surrender. The composite around the upper bolt crumbled like chalk under a chisel, and the bolt dropped free and rang once on the floor. The lower bolt followed a heartbeat later, and the entire left side of the door swung inward on its remaining hinge with a groan that sounded organic, alive, grateful. Sevhel's forearm burned where he'd braced it. The skin hadn't broken, but something underneath would bruise spectacularly. He could feel the heat of blood pooling where capillaries had burst. His shoulder ached, his breath came hard. The door hung open at an angle, still attached by the right side mounts, but listing like a wounded ship. The corridor beyond was the same gray, the same orange light, the same recycled nothing air, but it was outside. He stood there for one breath, two. Then the cell to his left spoke, a sound, a short, hard exhalation, the kind a man makes when something he expected finally arrives. The wall between the cells was the same composite, but the sound carried through it clearly enough. Whoever was in there had been listening, had been waiting, had heard the mount give and the bolt ring and the door groan, and had already decided what it meant. Sevhel stepped into the corridor. The adjacent cell was identical to his, same door, same housing, same mounting bolts seated in the same adequate wall. He looked at it and knew he could break it the same way, faster now, because he knew where the grain ran. He just didn't have to. The door opened from the inside, worked, not broken. The locking mechanism had been manipulated patiently and precisely by fingers that had found whatever the equivalent of a latch was and convinced it to do something its designers hadn't intended. The door swung smoothly, and the man who stepped through it moved past Sevhel and checked both directions of the corridor in a single sweep of his head. Brief, complete, no wasted motion. He was shorter than Sevhel by a hand's width and built differently, compact, dense, with shoulders shaped by carrying weight rather than swinging it. His skin was brown and warm against the sodium gray, and he wore something that didn't belong here, a quilted garment, teal and orange, that blazed against the dead monochrome of the corridor like a shout in a library. The colors were vivid, defiant, the only real color Sevhel had seen since the beach. The man finished his sweep and turned back to Sevhel. Dark eyes, calm and certain, belonging to someone who had fought things before and expected to fight things again and saw no reason to remark on it. Quali, the man said. Sevhel did not know the word. He knew the tone, he knew the set of the jaw, and the way the man's weight had already shifted to the balls of his feet, ready to move. The word meant good, or ready. But this is what I was waiting for. It meant the same thing in any language. Then the corridor spoke. Containment alert, block 7 gamma. Standard response dispatched. The voice was flat and passionless and came from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the air itself. It had the cadence of someone reading a list of supplies. No alarm, no urgency. A routine event in a routine log on a routine ship where routine things happened on schedule, and nothing had ever gone wrong badly enough to require a different tone of voice. The drone arrived 12 seconds later. It came from the right side corridor, hovering at chest height, roughly the size and shape of a barrel, with the aesthetic sensibilities of a brick. Industrial, functional. It had no face, no features that suggested personality or intent. It had a central aperture that tracked Sevhel with the same flat orange glow as everything else, and 2 flanking projectors that hummed at a frequency he could feel in his teeth. It was a tool, a containment tool designed to subdue and recontain the most dangerous things that 100 harvested worlds had ever produced, and it did its job the way everything on this ship did its job, competently, adequately, without imagination. It had never met a thing from Earth. Seven Siwo and Soen Sim, the drone's aperture tracked him. The flanking projectors, charged with a sound like wasps in a jar. Seven reached back and took hold of the door he'd sheared free. It was heavy, dense composite, layered over whatever structural bone the builders had used, still attached by one hinge that he wrenched loose with a twist that cost him something in his wrist he'd pay for later. The door came free. He held it lengthwise, like a shield, like a plank, like the thing it had always been, a slab of material meant to absorb force. The drone fired. The projectors discharged into the door. Sevhel felt the impact through his arms, a jolt, electrical, something that numbed his fingers and tried to tell his muscles to stop working. The door absorbed it. The door had been built to absorb it, because the door had been built to contain the same things the drone was built to contain, and no one in the design chain had considered the possibility that a piece of containment infrastructure might be turned around. Sevhel advanced. The drone fired again. The door took it again. His arms shook, and his teeth ached, and the numbness crawled up to his elbows. But his legs were fine, and his legs were what mattered, because the distance was closing. 3 steps. 2. The drone began to reverse. Some algorithm in its functional core recognized that the engagement parameters had shifted outside its operational envelope. It started to recalculate. Sevhel did not recalculate. Sevhel swung the door. The impact was deeply satisfying in a way that transcended language or culture or the century a man happened to be born in. The drone's housing crumpled. Its projectors snapped off at their mounts. It hit the far wall, bounced once, and came to rest on the floor in a posture that suggested it was reconsidering its career. Then its central light went out, and it was just components. Silence. The corridor hummed. The lights buzzed. Somewhere in the ship's administrative architecture, a subroutine was logging the event and routing a notification to a queue that would be reviewed during the next standard oversight cycle, which was not soon. Sevhel set the door down. His arms trembled. His wrist throbbed where he torqued the hinge loose, and his fingers were still half numb from the projector discharge. He flexed them, one hand then the other, until the feeling began to crawl back. The man in the teal and orange garment stood where he had been standing throughout, 3 paces behind, offset to the left, watching the corridor intersection that Sevhel's back had been turned to. He had not moved to help. He had not needed to. He had done something more useful. He had watched the angles. "Is there more?" Sevhel asked. He said it in his own tongue, because he had no other, but he said it with a look down the corridor and a gesture, open hand, palm up. What else? The man understood. He held up 2 fingers. Then he paused, his head tilted, and Sevhel realized he was listening, not to the corridor, but through it, tracking something by vibration or rhythm, the way you track the ship's crew by the pattern of their feet on the deck above. The 2 fingers became 3. Sevhel nodded. 3 was manageable. 3 was a raiding party, and raiding parties could be broken. But that was for later. Right now there was something else. He moved down the corridor to the far wall, past the cell block they'd come from to the next section over, marked with a different symbol above the entry. He put his hand flat against the surface and listened. Breathing, through the wool, through whatever divided this section from the next. Unmistakable, the rhythm of someone awake and aware and holding very still, the way prey held still, the way people held still when they were listening as hard as they could and trying to decide if what they heard was rescue or something worse. Examine the mechanism on this door different from his. The housing was the same composite, but the lock configuration was more complex. Additional bolt points, a magnetic seal his cell hadn't had. He could force it. The wall would give the same way his wall had given, because whoever built the cells had built all the walls from the same adequate material. But it would be loud. He looked at the man in teal and orange. The man looked at the door. Then he looked up, past the ceiling, tracking the patrol road above them by sound alone. He held up a hand. Wait, there was a window. Narrow. The patrol would pass, and there would be a gap between its passing and its return, and in that gap the noise would go unheard. The man began counting. His lips moved, silent and precise. One finger curled. 2, 3. Sevhel braced his shoulder against the mount. Behind the wall, someone breathed. The ventilation cycle was 90 seconds. Deka had counted it 11 times now, ear pressed to the wall where the housing met the floor, lips moving on the numbers. 90 seconds in, 90 seconds hold, 90 seconds out, which meant the life support system was calibrated for something with smaller lungs than hers, or slower respiration, or both. It went into the architecture she was building inside her skull, the only architecture she had left. Hydraulic release mechanism. She'd found it on the third cycle, when the feeding slot opened, and she'd caught the sound. Hydraulic, not magnetic, not electronic. The pressure signature came up through the floor when the door engaged, a faint tremor in the ceramic composite that she could feel through her boots if she stood in exactly the right spot. Late stage design, meaning someone built this before they understood what they were designing. The weakness was structural. She just needed a lever point and something to lever with. She didn't have either of those things. The cell was 3 meters by 2. The walls were ceramic composite, harder than they looked. She tested that with her knuckles on the first day, and still had the bruise to show for it. The floor was the same material, seamless except where the feeding slot housing created a raised lip along the base of the door. The light was sodium orange, the color of parking lot lamps in places she was never going to see again, and it didn't turn off. There was no window, there was no furniture, there was a drain in the floor that she had decided firmly and permanently not to think about in detail. She thought about the hydraulics instead. The door housing had a tolerance gap, maybe 4 centimeters where the frame met the wall panel on the left side. Even the factory gap, not damage. The gap that happened when a civilization built 10,000 of something and stopped checking the specs. Inside that gap she could see the hydraulic cylinder, the piston rod, the mounting bracket that held the whole assembly to the frame. The bracket was the weak point. The piston and the cylinder would hold, the bracket wouldn't. It was load-bearing but not reinforced at the join. If she could get something thin and rigid into the gap and apply lateral force at the right angle, the bracket would shear before the piston would. And if the bracket sheared, the piston would lose its mounting and the door would drop under its own weight. She knew this the way she knew field generators, the way she knew water pump assemblies and solar panel junction boxes, and the pitch of a diesel engine about to throw a rod. Pattern recognition, systems thinking, everything built by hands, any hands, human or otherwise, had a failure point, and the failure point was almost always where the designer had gotten bored. The problem was the lever. She tested the feeding slot cover, too flexible. She tested a piece of her own clothing. The cargo pants had a metal zipper pull, which was laughable. She tested her own fingers against the gap and confirmed that, while she could feel the bracket, she could not apply enough force with the meat of her hand to do anything except hurt herself. So she sat with her back against the wall opposite the door, and she named things: the wall material, ceramic composite, likely sintered, grain structure, visible under the sodium light if she looked at the right angle. The feeding slot, automated, timed to the same 90-second cycle as the ventilation, which suggested a centralized timer governing all cell functions on this block. The floor drain, she was not thinking about the floor drain. The light source, recessed panel, no visible filament, or LED equivalent, probably luminescent coating on a substrate. The air, recycled, faintly metallic, with an undertone she couldn't place, organic but not human organic, like whetstone in a cave with things living in it. Naming was control. If she could name it, she could think about it. If she could think about it, she could find the failure point. And if she could find the failure point, something was watching her through the wall. It had been there for a while. Deka went still, controlled, the way she'd learned in Mogadishu, the first time a vehicle had stopped too close to the compound gate and she'd had 3 seconds to decide whether to run or assess. She'd assessed. She was alive because she'd assessed. The gap was on the right side wall, low, near the junction where the wall panel met the floor. A separation in the paneling, maybe 6 centimeters, maybe a little more. Manufacturing tolerance again, or thermal expansion in the composite. She hadn't paid much attention to it because it didn't lead to the door mechanism. But now she could feel the quality of the air coming through that gap change, warmer, carrying a breath that wasn't hers. Something is watching me through the wall. It's been there for a while. It isn't afraid of me, which is either very good or very bad. Deka turned her head slowly, brought her face down to the level of the gap. The sodium light didn't penetrate far into the opening. She could see the interior edge of the wall panel, the shadow beyond, and then a sliver of the adjacent cell. Different light in there, slightly cooler, and in that cooler light, very close to the gap, an eye, human eye, dark brown, almost black, with a focused stillness that Deka associated with people who waited for a living, not panicked, not aggressive, the patience of someone who had been observing Deka's systematic assessment of her cell and had chosen to wait until Deka arrived at this discovery on her own terms. The eye did not look away. Deka did not look away. They stayed there, the two of them, for a long moment, Deka breathing, the other person breathing, the ventilation cycle moving through its 90-second rhythm around them, indifferent to the fact that 2 human beings had just found each other in the belly of something that should not exist. Then Deka raised her hand slowly and pointed at the door. She pressed her finger against the gap where the hydraulic housing was visible on her own side of the wall. Then she mimed the action, something thin inserted at an angle, pushed laterally. The shearing force, the bracket failing, the door dropping. She held up her fingers to approximate the dimensions 6 centimeters long, no more than 1 centimeter wide, rigid. The eye on the other side tracked each gesture. The person behind that eye understood mechanics, or understood intent, or both. Then nothing happened. For what felt like a long time, nothing happened. The eye watched. Deka's hand was still raised in the approximation of a tool she didn't have. The ventilation cycle completed twice. She could hear her own pulse in her ears, the stupid mammalian drumbeat that she'd been listening to since the lights came on and she'd woken up in a box that smelled like wet stone. Then a hand came through the gap. It was a woman's hand, brown, calloused, with grip strength that spoke of years working with her hands in ways that left marks on the bone. The fingers held a metal shim, thin, rigid, approximately 6 centimeters long and 1 centimeter wide. Both had been shaped. The edges failed or worked somehow, the tip angled to match exactly the insertion point that Deka had been miming. Deka stared at it. The tool was already made. It was already the right size. This woman had been watching Deka assess the door mechanism. She had understood what Deka needed before Deka had communicated it. She had fashioned the tool and then waited for Deka to ask. Deka took the shim. It was warm from the other woman's grip. The metal was unfamiliar, some component of this cell's own anatomy that had been worked into utility by patience and a knowledge of materials that Deka could not identify. "You already had it," Deka said. Her voice sounded strange in the cell, too loud, too human, bouncing off ceramic composite that had never been designed to absorb the frequencies of someone speaking English. "You already made the tool." The woman said nothing. The hand withdrew. The eye remained at the gap, watching. Deka looked at the shim, looked at the door, looked back at the gap where the eye waited. Then she went to work. The insertion point was exactly where she'd mapped it. The shim slid into the tolerance gap with a resistance she could feel through her fingertips, the ceramic catching, releasing, catching again as she worked the tool deeper. She found the bracket, felt the shim seat against the joint where load-bearing met mounting. The angle was critical, too shallow, and she'd just scratched the surface. Too steep, and she'd bend the shim before the bracket gave it. She adjusted, breathed, felt the ventilation cycle hit its 90-second peak and applied lateral force. The bracket did not shear. She applied more force. Her forearm trembled. The shim rang against the hydraulic housing, a thin metallic note that the cell swallowed. The bracket still did not shear. Deka closed her eyes, felt the architecture, the tolerance gap, the piston, the bracket, the mounting. If I had to fail a point in her mind, like a knot in a rope there, right there, if she shifted the shim 2 millimeters deeper and changed the angle by maybe 5 degrees and pushed, the bracket sheared. The sound was brief, industrial, a crack like a cable tie snapping under tension. Then the piston lost its mounting. Then the hydraulic cylinder, with nothing holding the door in its frame, surrendered to gravity. The door fell, straight down, the full weight of it, ceramic composite and hydraulic housing and frame, hitting the corridor floor with a resonant clang that traveled through the deck, plating like a struck bell. Deka felt it in her knees. The sodium orange light of the corridor flooded the cell, brighter than the cell light had been, and she was looking at a space she had never seen. "Okay," she said. Her hands were shaking. Okay. What's the exfil plan?" Well, the corridor was empty. She had expected guards. She had expected alarms. She had expected the immediate and overwhelming response of a system that should have noticed the door falling out of its frame. But the corridor was empty and silent except for the deeper hum of the ship's systems, and the sodium orange lamps, stretching in both directions, cast identical pools of light on identical gray floor plates, and nothing came in. The timing was fortunate. Somewhere on this ship, maybe close, maybe far, she couldn't tell, something was happening that had drawn the patrols away. She didn't know what. She filed it. Deka stepped into the corridor and started naming things. Junction box to the left, maintenance conduit overhead, deck plating with a visible seam running perpendicular to the wall line. The air was the same recycled metallic but stronger out here, and the ventilation cycle was different, faster, like the corridor system ran on a separate loop. Behind her, the wall panel in her cell shifted. The woman came through the gap she'd widened from the other side, not through Deka's fallen door, but through the wall itself. The panel she'd been working on long before Deka had woken up. She emerged into the corridor like someone stepping over a familiar threshold, calm, economical, already looking in both directions. She was not tall, lean, dark-haired, with a face built for wind and distance. Her clothes were leather and woven fiber, not modern, not medieval, something Deka's mental catalog couldn't place. Her eyes moved the way someone's did when they assess terrain for a living. Junction left, junction right, overhead, floor, back to Deka, then away again. She was already mapping the junctions. Deka was still naming things under her breath. They had been out for 15 seconds and were already doing completely different things. The woman looked at Deka. With focused attention, she was making a decision about how much Deka could be trusted to keep up. Then she turned to the left junction and started walking, and Deka understood that the woman had already decided which direction to go and was not going to wait. Deka followed. They made it 40 meters down the corridor, past 3 identical cell doors, all sealed, past a junction that the woman evaluated and dismissed with a single glance, before the sound reached them. Footsteps, heavy, coming from the cross corridor ahead and to the right. The woman stopped. Deka stopped. They both pressed against the wall. The footsteps grew louder. There was a secondary sound, a rhythmic scraping, metal on metal, something being dragged or carried. A man came around the junction corner. That is a very large man holding a weapon that used to be a different thing. He was extremely calm about this. Read the body language. Read the body language. He is friendly. He was enormous, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that suggested he had been built by a life of physical violence and was entirely comfortable in the architecture of his own body. His hair was matted and wild. His beard was thick and unkempt, and his clothes were rough woven material stained with things Deka did not want to identify. In his right hand he carried what had recently been a containment drone, or half of one. The casing was cracked open, the interior components gutted, and what remained was a slab of composite material with an edge that someone had made sharp through enthusiastic application to the corridor wall. He saw them and stopped. Behind him a second figure stepped into view, smaller, compact, moving with the deliberate grace of someone whose body was a practiced instrument. He wore something that might have once been a padded cotton gambeson, and his skin bore the raised welts of recent electrical burns in a pattern that suggested he had walked into something painful and kept walking. His face was calm, the face of someone who had made a decision about the nature of his circumstances and was no longer surprised by anything. The four of them stood in the sodium-orange corridor of an alien ship and looked at each other. The large man's eyes moved from Deka to the woman behind her, then to the shim still in Deka's hand, then to the direction they'd come from. His expression was complicated: surprise, recognition of something familiar in their posture, and the practical pleasure, like a man who'd been building a fire and just found dry kindling. The language was harsh and rhythmic, with sounds that Deka's linguistic awareness flagged as Germanic but not German. She understood nothing. The burned man behind him said something different, entirely different, tonal, clipped, with a cadence that was almost musical in its precision. Deka understood nothing. The woman beside Deka said something, also different, also utterly opaque. Deka looked at each of them. Three people from eras and places she could not yet locate, speaking languages she could not yet name, standing in a corridor that none of them had been born within 1,000 light years of. "You're human," Deka said. Her voice cracked on it, just slightly, because the relief was physical, a pressure behind her sternum that she had not acknowledged until this moment. "You're okay. Hi, I'm Deka." She extended her hand. The large man looked at it. He looked at her hand the way someone looks at an unfamiliar tool whose purpose they can see is important to the person offering it, but whose function is entirely unclear. His brow furrowed. He glanced at the burned man, who offered no assistance whatsoever. He looked back at the hand. It was an excellent face. The woman, the one who had been watching through the wall, who had made the tool before Deka knew she needed it, who had already mapped 3 junctions in the time it took Deka to name the corridor, turned away from all of them. He was looking down the other corridor, the one that led deeper into the ship, away from the cells, towards something she had apparently already decided was worth walking toward. She said something in her own language. It was brief and unhurried, and though none of them understood the words, the meaning was the oldest thing any human had ever communicated to any other. "This way." Then she started walking. The large man followed. He adjusted his grip on the drone weapon, shifted it to his left hand, and fell in behind the woman without hesitation. He walked the way heavy things move, inevitable, unhurried, absolutely certain. The burned man followed. His steps was lighter, measured, and he positioned himself at the large man's flank with the instinct of someone who understood formation without needing to be told. Deka stood in the corridor. She looked back the way they'd come, the fallen door, the empty cells, the sodium-orange light stretching into the silence of a ship that hadn't noticed them yet. She looked the way the others were going, deeper, darker, towards something she couldn't name and couldn't map and couldn't prepare for. She went. The ship moved the way water moved. Every corridor leaned somewhere. Pakla had been watching which way. 3 feeding cycles since the bright light and the cold floor and the hum that never stopped. 3 cycles of watching the walls and listening to the rhythm of feet that were not feet, not exactly, too evenly spaced, too consistent in weight, the gait of something that had never needed to run from anything. She had catalogued these rhythms the way she catalogued hoofbeats on stone versus hoofbeats on dry grass versus hoofbeats on mud after rain. The ship had a grain to it. The main corridors were wide and sloped faintly toward the center, the way a dry creek bed sloped toward its lowest point. The feeding tubules ran along that gradient. The air pushed that direction. The patrols moved with it, downstream, always downstream, because even things that built ships this large obeyed the logic of the path of least resistance. The side corridors ran against the grain, narrower, dimmer amber where the main passages burned their flat orange. The vibration from whatever drove the ship was louder here, a deep pulse she could feel through the balls of her feet if she stood still. She had stood still often these 3 cycles, watching, counting, learning which corridors the patrols grazed and which they avoided. 2 routes were closed to her. The first ran parallel to the main passage and crossed a junction where the patrols intersected every 40 breaths. The second descended through a wider shaft, but ended at a sealed door that hummed with a sound she associated with the barriers in the cells, a sound like a wasp's nest made of lightning. A other route was maintenance access, narrower still, lower ceiling. The amber light here was intermittent, and the walls were lined with conduit housings that pulsed with warmth. No patrol had used this route in 3 feeding cycles. The dust on the floor, not dust exactly, but a fine residue of something metallic and gray, was undisturbed except by the scurrying of small automated things that moved on tracks and ignored anything biological. She chose the 3rd route the way she would have chosen a game trail through broken country, unwatched. There were 4 of them. The large man with the red beard walked directly behind her. He carried a section of metal housing from the thing he had torn apart in the corridor, the floating machine that had tried to restrain them. The housing was the length of his forearm and twice as heavy as anything sensible to carry through a passage this narrow, and he carried it at his shoulder like a man carrying a war club into unfamiliar timber. The man with the red beard was too large for this passage, and he knew it. He's adjusting, that was worth knowing. Behind him, the lean man with the sharp face and the braided topknot moved with the quiet of someone trained to move quietly. His breathing was controlled. His footfalls landed on the front of his feet. He watched everything, where Pakla read terrain. He cataloged threats, scanning for the angle he hadn't anticipated, the person about to try killing him from it. She could work with that. Last came the young woman from the cells, the modern one. Pakla did not have a word for what made her modern exactly, but something in the way she moved and the way her eyes processed the ship said that wherever she came from, it was closer to this place than any of theirs. She had understood the floating machine. She had touched it and known what it was for, or at least what kind of thing it was. That knowledge lived in her hands, in the automatic way she reached for surfaces and interfaces as they passed. None of them shared a language. This was fine. Language was a luxury for people who had time to sit and explain. Pakla had been leading hunting parties since she was 14. The best ones never needed words. She raised her left hand, fingers spread. Stop? The group stopped. She tilted her head, listening, and how the corridor branched left toward the main passage, right toward a descending ramp she had scouted during the second feeding cycle. The left branch carried the distant sound of that even, unhurried gait, distant but present. She pointed right, moved, they followed. The ramp descended at a grade steep enough that the large man had to brace the housing against his opposite shoulder to keep it from clanging against the wall. He did this without being told, shifting his grip and his center of weight in a single motion that spoke of long practice carrying awkward loads through tight spaces. Long ships, Pakla thought, though she did not have the word for them. She had the concept, a man accustomed to ducking below decks on vessels not built for his frame. The ramp opened into a junction where 3 maintenance corridors converged. The air here tasted different, recycled and thin, with an undertone of something chemical and warm, like heated metal. The vibration from the drives was strong enough to feel in her teeth. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. Counted. The patrol on the level below moved in a pattern she had timed across 2 full cycles. 2 personnel, not the floating machines, but actual beings in fitted gray suits with equipment at their hips. They walked the lower corridor at an interval of roughly 200 breaths. They had passed this junction 30 breaths ago, heading downstream. They would loop back in 170 breaths to cross the junction, traverse the connector passage, and reach the bay she had identified during her first cycle, the large space, the one with the wide doors, and the sound of many bodies breathing. She held up both hands, fingers spread, closed them, opened them again, wait, then moved. The lean man with the top knot read the gesture instantly. He settled his weight and became still, the way a cat became still, before deciding whether the thing in the grass was worth pursuing. Good. The young woman was breathing too loudly. She may not have known it. Her jaw was tight, her nostrils flared, and she was riding the fear the way someone rides a horse that wants to bolt, keeping it between her knees instead of letting it run. Pakla noted both things. Both were useful to know. She counted 60 breaths, listened. The patrol's footfalls had faded below the threshold of the ship's vibration. She moved. The connector passage narrowed to a point where the large man had to turn sideways, the drone housing scraping against the conduit housings with a sound like a blade drawn across stone. Too loud. Far too loud in a corridor designed to carry sound along its length like a riverbed carrying water. Pakla raised her flat hand to him. Stop. She pointed at the housing, then at the floor, then at him. The gesture was specific and expected compliance. He looked at her, his eyes were pale in the amber light, and there was a calculation happening behind them, whether the weapon was worth the noise. She watched him make the decision. He shifted the housing from his shoulder, rotated it, and tucked it lengthwise against his ribs, gripping it underhand. The profile narrowed by half. The scraping stopped. He did not put it down. She had not truly expected him to, but he had adapted the carry without argument, without the stiffening of a man whose pride had been touched. He adjusted because the situation required adjustment, and he understood that she was the one reading the situation. That was worth more than the weapon. She moved forward. The passage widened again after 10 paces, opening onto a horizontal shaft that ran perpendicular to their route, a maintenance crawlway, square in cross-section, lined with the same warm conduit housings. Below the shaft, through a grille of perforated metal, she could see the lower corridor. 2 figures moved through it. Pakla dropped to her stomach and pressed her face to the grille. The 2 combined security personnel walked with the unhurried cadence of beings on a route they had walked 1,000 times. Their suits were smooth, pale gray, sealed at the neck and wrist. Equipment rode their hips, tools as much as weapons. Their posture belonged to workers, not warriors. They did not look up. She rolled onto her side and gestured the others down. Low, still, now. The large man lowered himself with surprising control for his size, the drone housing flat against the shaft floor, his beard brushing the grill. The lean man was already prone, having read her body language 2 seconds before the gesture. The young woman descended last, her breathing sharp and quick, her hands flat against the shaft wall. 2 meters below them, the patrol passed. Pakla pressed her palm against the shaft wall. She felt the footfalls through the metal, a rhythm as readable as hoofbeats. 1, 2, 1, 2. The same even gait, the same distribution of weight. Neither personnel deviated, neither paused, neither glanced at the maintenance shaft above their heads, because the maintenance shaft was for maintenance, and they were not maintenance. The vibration diminished, faded, vanished into the larger hum of the ship. Pakla counted to 40. Then she counted to 40 again, because the cost of patience was nothing, and the cost of impatience was everything. She rose, gestured, moved. The holding bay opened before them like a valley after a canyon, sudden width, sudden depth, sudden population. It was larger than anything Pakla had seen on the ship. The ceiling vaulted 3 times her height, supported by structural ribs that curved like the bones of an enormous animal's chest. The amber lighting was brighter here, almost warm, and the air moved in a slow circulation that carried the smell of bodies and recycled atmosphere and something antiseptic that failed to mask the human underneath. 40 people, perhaps more. Pakol to edge the tates, the way she counted a herd, by density and distribution and the quality of their stillness. The recently arrived were easy to identify. They sat or lay in tight clusters near the walls, their bodies pulled inward, their eyes tracking without focus. The disorientation was bone deep. People pulled from their lives into a place that did not obey any rule they had ever learned. Some had been crying. Some had stopped crying and moved into a blankness that was worse. The longer held were different. Their posture was lower, their movements smaller. They had learned the feeding cycle and the patrol pattern and the boundaries of the space, and the learning had cost them something. They watched the newcomers with the flat eyes of people who had already been where the newcomers were and had nothing useful to say about it. And then there were the few who were neither broken nor dulled. Pakla read the bay the way she read a campsite after a raid. Who is awake? Who is injured? Who is armed? Where are the exits? 2 exits, the wide door they had entered through, and a second, larger door at the far wall, sealed with the lightning wasp hum. Beefy clusters of functional individuals, a woman binding another woman's arm with a strip of fabric, 2 men sitting back to back, awake, watching opposite directions, and 1 man standing. He was standing the way a column stands, because that was what it was built to do, and it had not yet received instruction to do anything else. He was shorter than the red-bearded man, but broader through the chest and shoulders, built in a way that suggested his body had been assembled for a specific purpose and had spent decades fulfilling it. His hair was cut short. His arms were bare and ropey with muscle, earned from years of carrying weight over distance. Devosis by the vine and the still, held in place by discipline rather than calm. He reads trackers, Pakla thought. He saw me first. That one was a soldier for a long time. His eyes had found her the moment she entered the bay, Pakla, because she was at the front and she moved like someone who had chosen the route, and a man who had commanded other men in the field knew that the person at the front of a file in hostile terrain was the one making the decisions. He assessed her. She watched him do it, the quick sweep from her feet to her hands to her eyes, the unconscious cataloging of threat and capability and intent that soldiers performed the way other people breathe. She assessed him back. He spoke. The words were in a language she did not know, clipped, rhythmic, shaped by a tongue accustomed to commands. The meaning was opaque. The tone was clear. It was the tone of a man who had been waiting with deep, professional patience, who had evaluated the situation and concluded that his best option was to remain standing and ready until someone with a plan arrived, and who was now observing with dry, unmistakable satisfaction that someone with a plan had arrived. He nodded. Pakla nodded back. Behind her, the young woman was already scanning the bay, her eyes moving the way they moved when she was reading systems, quick, lateral, building a picture from pieces. The lean man had positioned himself where he could see both entrances. The large man stood with the drone housing resting against his thigh, his presence filling the doorway behind them like a cork in a bottle. Good, they were learning each other. That was how a hunt party became a hunt party, through the accumulation of correct decisions made in proximity. The bay had 40 lives in it. Some of them could move, some of them could fight. The standing man had already identified which were which. She could see it in the economy of his gaze, the way it did not linger on the broken or the dulled, but returned again and again to the functional few. But the bay also had a problem, and Pakla had seen it before the standing man spoke. The patrol routes had changed. She had timed them across 3 feeding cycles, and the pattern that had held steady for the first 2 had shifted during the 3rd. The interval was shorter. The downstream route now included a route past the sealed door at the far wall, a route that had not existed before. The ship's keepers did not know what they had yet, not precisely, but they were tightening the way a rider tightened a cinch before rough country. And there was one more thing. In the far corner of the bay, half-shadowed by a structural rib, a single Combine guard stood at a secondary access point. He had not left with the patrol. He carried a device at his hip, longer than the tools the patrol personnel wore, shaped with an intent that said it was for harm. His posture was different from the patrol's worker's gait, stiffer, more alert. He was looking at the standing man. He was looking at the standing man with the expression of someone deciding whether a threshold had been crossed, whether the thing that was technically still within parameters had become the thing that required a report, a response, an escalation. Pakla watched the guard watch the soldier. She watched the soldier watch the guard watching him. Neither of them moved. The bay hummed. The amber light held steady. 40-some lives breathed and waited and did not know what was about to happen. But the two men standing knew. And then Pakla, who had been reading the distance between predator and prey since before she could ride, knew too. The interval was closing. The guard was afraid. Quintus had seen enough panicking men to know the difference, and this was controlled, protocol deep fear, a soldier trained for a situation that was not the situation he was in. The alien stood 7 feet from the crate line, weapon shouldered, the muzzle tracking the room in a slow, methodical sweep that never settled on any single target. His posture was textbook, his breathing wasn't. Quintus sat down on a cargo crate. He placed his hands on his knees, palms flat, fingers loose. He let his shoulders settle. He looked at the guard. The guard looked at Quintus. The holding bay hummed around them, recycled air pushing through overhead ducts, the low vibration of the ship's guts somewhere beneath the floor, the murmur and shuffle of roughly 40 human bodies in various states of shock, injury, and furious disorientation. The sodium orange light made everything look like the inside of a kiln. It smelled like sweat and the chemical flatness of whatever the Combine pumped through the ventilation. Something designed, Quintus suspected, to keep cargo sedated. He could feel it in the back of his throat, a faint numbness that wanted to be fatigued. He ignored it. The guard's weapon hummed, some kind of directed energy. Quintus had seen a version of it in the corridor, the pulse that had knocked one of the captives into a wall and held him there until he stopped moving. Non-lethal. The guard's authorization, whatever it was, did not extend to killing merchandise. That was useful information. Quintus sat. The guard stood. Neither of them moved. You have your protocol, Quintus thought. I have watched men follow protocol when the protocol was already dead. I have seen centuries hold formation on a bridge that was falling into a river because nobody with sufficient rank had told them to stop. And you will stand there because your instructions say stand there. And you will wait for backup because your instructions say wait for backup. And your backup is not coming because the man who broke the door killed 2 of your colleagues. And there is a sound in this ship that was not here an hour ago. The sound of people who have stopped being afraid of you. He waited. The guard's weapon tracked left, tracked right, settled on Quintus again. The alien's face was unreadable in the way all Combine faces were unreadable. Too many hard planes, eyes set too wide apart, the skin a gray blue that absorbed the amber light and gave nothing back. But the hands Quintus could read. The hands gripped the weapon a fraction too tight. The weight shifted from one foot to the other, left, right, left again, with the rhythm of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. You have 3 choices, Quintus said. Latin. The words came easy and quiet and absolutely calm. You can try me, you can wait for your patrol, or you can step back and let someone else file the report. The guard did not understand a single word. The tone did the work. Quintus watched the alien's grip shift. Watch the weight settle. Watch the calculation happen behind those wide-set eyes. The equation of a functionary who had been told what the cargo was and what the cargo could do, and who was now running the numbers against the fact that the cargo was looking at him without expression and had not moved. The guard stepped back 3 paces until his spine met the wall beside the bay's secondary access panel. He kept his weapon up, He kept his eyes on Quintus, but his feet had chosen the wall. Secondary protocol. Hold position. Await reinforcement. Do not escalate without authorization. The guard would stand there and wait for someone with a higher clearance to tell him what the situation was. He would wait for a very long time. It was a victory that looked like nothing at all. Quintus noted it the way he had noted every victory in 40 years of service, without celebration, with immediate forward assessment. The guard was neutralized, a variable postponed, not resolved. You kept an eye on postponed variables. He stood up from the crate. The door is always the easy part, he thought, surveying the holding bay. Everyone celebrates the door. The 5 minutes after the door is when you find out if you have a breakout or a riot. 40 people, give or take. Quintus moved through them the way he had moved through replacement cohorts on the eastern frontier, watching, not speaking, because speech required a shared language, and he shared a language with exactly none of these people. The way a man held himself told you everything, whether he had been a fighter before this, whether he was injured, whether he was thinking about the next 5 minutes, or still trapped in the last 5. The holding bay was open and industrial, a broad rectangle of gray deck plate and amber light. The crate lines formed rough channels through the space. Most of the captives had clustered along the walls or between the crate stacks, natural defensible positions chosen by instinct, good instinct, undirected instinct. Direction was what he could provide. He started with the ones whose eyes were moving. A man near the forward crate line, broad-chested, dark-skinned, sitting upright with his back straight and his hands resting on his thighs. His eyes tracked the room in a sweep that had the discipline of habit. When Quintus stopped in front of him, the man looked up. Quintus pointed to the man, then pointed to a position near the bay's main entrance. The man hesitated for a count of 2, assessing, then stood and walked to where Quintus had indicated. Quintus moved to the next, a woman near the secondary wall, compact, scarred hands, watching everything with the focused stillness of someone who had spent her life reading the intentions of things that could kill her. The tracker from the corridor. She had been at the back of the group during the movement from the cells, and she had been the first to notice when the patrol drone changed its route. When Aishe didn't point at her, he simply caught her eye and looked toward the junction corridor that led away from the bay. She was already watching it. She nodded once and moved to cover the corridor mouth. One by one, gesture and direction. Some of them understood immediately. They had been waiting for exactly this, for someone to stand up and have a plan and begin executing it with the calm certainty that said, this is what we are doing now. Some took a moment, needed a second gesture, needed to watch someone else stand first. That was fine. We did not need everyone to be first. We needed enough firsts to make the seconds feel like they were joining something that was already working. He placed the big Northman and the scarred fighter near the front. Simple logic. They were already armed with salvaged Combine equipment. They had already killed in the corridor, and their bodies broadcast violence the way a fire broadcasts heat. The Northman, the one who had torn the cell door out of its mounting, held a length of metal conduit, like it was a natural extension of his arm. The scarred one, smaller, leaner, carried a piece of Combine drone casing with edges he had already sharpened against the deck plate. Neither of them needed to be told what the front was for. They went. They placed the young woman, the one who touched the ship's systems like she could hear them, near the woman who was teaching herself the Combine language. He did not explain why. Within the hour they would understand. The woman learning to speak to the ship and the woman learning to read it were the two most valuable people in the bay, and everything between them and the corridor needed to be bodies. The young woman stared at Quintus when he gestured her into position. She said something, her language clipped and modern sounding, with the cadence of someone who is processing fear by cataloging it. I think that was an org chart, she said to the woman beside her, who could not understand her either. Did he just make an org chart at us? The tone was bewildered, slightly delighted. Quintus didn't understand the words, but he understood the register, someone who had just recognized a system and found it funny. He moved on, person by person, group by group. He did not give orders because orders required language. He gave structure, and the structure was a language older than any tongue he'd ever spoken. You stand here. You stand with her. You, can you walk? Show me. Good. You, stay near these two. Each person got one clear gesture. Each gesture said, I see what you can do, and I have a place for you to do it. The bay reorganized itself around him like water finding its level. A third did not stand. Quintus paused near the rear crate line and looked at them. 9, perhaps 10 figures still seated or lying along the back wall. Some were injured. One woman had her arm cradled against her chest at an angle that said fracture, and the man near the corner had the unfocused stare of someone who had taken one of the Combine's compliance pulses too close to the skull. Others were intact in body. They were simply still, sitting with their backs to the wall, eyes open, breathing steady, present but unreachable, injured, fearful, or too far into whatever they do instead of hope, Quintus thought. I cannot carry them. The ones who stand know that. Some of them are grateful. He did not go back to them. He did not argue or coax or shame. You could not pour will into another person. You could only show them what was possible and trust their own weight to bring them upright or keep them down. He had seen it in every camp, every forced march, every cohort that had taken losses. There was a line between the people who would move and the people who would not, and the line was invisible and absolute and had nothing to do with courage. He turned his back on them and walked toward the front. He acknowledged them as beyond his reach right now and moved to the problem he could solve. 31. Quintus stood at the center of the bay and looked at what he had built. 3 clusters, each with a clear roll holder at its center. The Northman and the scarred fighter anchoring the vanguard, 7 others with them who had the build or the bearing of people who had fought something before today, the tracker holding the junction corridor, 4 others with her who moved quietly and watched the angles, the ship reader and the word learner in the 3rd cluster, surrounded by the rest, the body of the column, the ones who would move and carry and hold what needed holding. 81 people, 3 groups, no shared language, no shared history, no shared anything except the fact that they had been taken from their lives and put in boxes, and the boxes had not held. It would do, it would have to do. Hattori came from the side corridor. Quintus saw the movement first, a shadow shifting in the junction passage that the tracker was covering. The tracker went still, her hand dropping to the sharpened edge she carried. Then the figure stepped into the amber light, and the tracker's hand eased, because whoever this man was, he moved like someone who expected to be seen and was unconcerned about it. He was not tall. He carried himself as though height were irrelevant, which, in Quintus's experience, meant he had decided his other qualities compensated for it. He wore the same featureless Combine garment they all wore, but he wore it like borrowed clothing that he intended to return in worse condition than he'd received it. The vows swept the bay in a single pass, the 3 groups, the positions, the guards still backed against the wall, the corridor mouths, the ones who hadn't stood. He had not been in the main holding bay. He had come from somewhere else, a direction that suggested he'd been watching the patrol routes and the movement patterns in the adjacent corridors, mapping the ship's nervous system from a vantage point none of them had thought to claim. Exactly the position I would have chosen for intelligence gathering, Quintus thought. The man looked at Quintus's arrangement, looked at the 3 groups, the spacing, the logic of the formation, looked at Quintus. He nodded once. It was the smallest gesture in the room. It hit Quintus like a fist. He had not felt genuinely understood since he arrived. He had felt respected. The Northmen respected violence, and Quintus had shown enough of it in the corridor. He had felt useful. The ship reader and the word learner had accepted his direction because it was clearly correct. But this was different. This required someone who looked at a formation and saw the bodies and the thinking that had placed them, the doctrine beneath the doctrine, the architecture of command. This man saw it. This man saw him. Good, Quintus said. Latin, 1 word. The man could not possibly have understood it. He understood it anyway. They stood together, both looking at the formation. Two commanders from different armies separated by 1,500 years and more distance than either of them could calculate. It did not matter. The assessment was the same. The formation was correct. The people were as ready as they were going to get. The next thing that happened would happen to all of them together. Quintus felt something settle in his chest, a tightness that had been there since the cell, since the corridor, since the moment the world ended and was replaced by this humming amber hell, finally loosening. He recognized it, the knowledge that he was not the only one carrying the weight. Then the tracker moved. It was subtle. The woman watching the junction corridor went from still to very still, in the way Quintus had learned to read it for a while. Her weight shifted, her eyes fixed on a point in the corridor. Her hand came up, not a wave but a stop. Hold. Something is different. The new men saw it at the same moment Quintus did. They both turned. The sound came a breath later, receiver than the light mechanical hum of the patrol drone they had been tracking. Multiple footfalls, coordinated, moving with purpose, and beneath the footfalls, a deeper sound, a vibration Quintus felt through the deck plate before he heard it through the air. Equipment, receiver equipment, than anything they had seen. Personnel, multiple, with the deliberate spacing and unhurried pace of a unit that expected to find exactly what it was looking for. The guard against the wall straightened, the first voluntary movement he had made in 20 minutes. His weapon came up, pointed away from Quintus this time, but ready, waiting for the authorization he had spent the entire standoff praying for. It was coming down the corridor. Quintus looked at the formation he had built. 31 people, 3 groups, armed with salvaged scrap and the bodies they'd been born with. He looked at the man beside him. The man was already looking at the corridor, and his expression was calculation, someone who had seen the next 5 moves and was deciding which one to play first. The organizing was done. Now came the test. The patrol would arrive in the corridor outside the holding bay in approximately 20 minutes. Hattori had counted the interval between the last 2 patrols, 31 minutes the first time, 28 the second, and noted the shortening. Someone in the chain of command had noticed the cell break. Someone had decided the response cadence needed tightening, and someone, almost certainly a different someone, had fielded the order to tighten it without reading the report on what had actually happened in the cell. This was the shape of the enemy, and Hattori had been mapping it since the moment the enormous Norseman had torn the cell door from its track. He sat at the edge of the staging area, back against a warm conduit housing, and turned the scrap of hull plating in his fingers. The fragment was roughly the size of his palm, a piece of the drone the Norseman had dismantled with his bare hands. Hattori had picked it up from the floor while the others were forming their positions. He had picked it up the way he picked up everything, because it was information, and information was architecture, and architecture was the difference between a castle that held and a castle that fell. Around him the holding bay hummed. The sodium orange light turned everything the color of a watchfire banked low. The tall Roman was organizing bodies near the center, gestures, demonstrations, the physical grammar of a man who had spent his life turning strangers into a unit. The woman who read terrain, the one with the wide-set eyes, who carried the stillness of years spent on open ground, had positioned herself at the corridor junction, watching the approaches. She had not been told to do this. She had simply gone to where watching was useful. They were competent, all of them, in their different registers. The Norseman was a weapon, the Roman was a commander, the terrain reader was precisely that. The young, dark-skinned woman who touched everything as though she expected it to answer. She was something else entirely, something Hattori did not have a word for yet, but she understood these walls and panels the way a castle engineer understood stone. Good. He did not need them to be anything other than what they were. He needed them to keep doing it for 20 more minutes, because in 20 minutes the patrol would come, and it would be larger than the last one, and it would end this. Unless Hattori ended it first, The captain wants his manifest corrected. The slaver wants his cargo secured. Those are different problems with different solutions. The patrol exists for the second. I need to make it solve the first. He had seen it in the way the Combine personnel moved. There were two authority structures on this vessel, and they overlapped badly. The one who sat on the raised platform, the captain, the one whose voice carried the cadence of a man reading from a ledger, wanted the disruption logged, categorized, and resolved through standard procedure. The other one, the one who walked the corridor edges rather than the center, the one whose eyes tracked the humans the way a falconer's tracked a raptor, wanted something different. The slaver wanted to understand what he was carrying. That was the gap. In every castle Hattori had ever studied, in every clan, every alliance, every war council he had survived, the gap between what the Lord wanted and what the retainer wanted was where leverage lived. You did not attack a castle at its strongest point. You attacked the relationship between the man who held the gate and the man who held the key, and you made them realize they wanted different doors opened. The guard who had broken in the holding bay, the one who had frozen when the Norsemen moved, had been a useful data point. Mid-tier security, trained for compliance, chose protocol over escalation. He had not fought. He had waited for someone to tell him what the protocol was, and when no one did, he had defaulted to inaction. That was the institution. Rules without adaptation. A machine that worked because no one had ever pushed hard enough to reveal the seams. The slaver, though, the slaver was different. The slaver was the only one on this ship who was actually thinking. I was in the patrol's route 40 minutes ago. He did not see me. That is the first thing I will put on the floor between us. Hattori turned the drone fragment one more time, then placed it inside the fold of his sleeve. He looked at the notation he had scratched into the residue on the conduit housing, a map of the patrol route, assembled from the sound of boots and the rhythm of the overhead address system. The route was a loop. It passed the holding bay approach corridor, continued past the junction he had identified by the change in air pressure, and returned to what he assumed was a security station near the vessel's center. He had been inside that loop 40 minutes ago, when the Norseman was still breaking the cell door. Hattori had been 3 corridors away, watching the patrol pass. He had pressed himself into a maintenance alcove that smelled of ozone and burnt sugar, and he had counted boots. 4. Standard formation. The one at the rear, the slaver, had paused at the alcove entrance for a full 2 seconds and had not looked in. His attention had been elsewhere. In that moment, the slaver had been listening to his communication device, and the message had been about the cell break, and the cell break was more interesting than a dark alcove that the behavioral scan had flagged as empty. The behavioral scan had been wrong. Hattori had been in the alcove. The scan had not detected him because Hattori had been standing very still, breathing very slowly, doing nothing that the scan's parameters recognized as threatening. He had been invisible to the system. Visible to the eye, perhaps, but invisible to the system. That was the second thing he would put on the floor. Hattori stood. He rolled his neck once, felt the vertebrae settle. The sleeve with the drone fragment hung correctly. He crossed to the conduit housing, pressed his thumb against the scratched patrol route diagram, and memorized the angles one final time. And Bewit part of it clean with the heel of his hand and scratched an addition, a mark indicating position, his position, where he had stood, inside the route, unseen. He did not inform the Roman. The Roman would try to stop him, and the Roman would be right to try, and Hattori would then have to explain a strategy in a language neither of them spoke. The explanation would cost minutes he did not have. Instead, Hattori walked to the corridor mouth, glanced once at the terrain reader stationed there. She saw him. Her eyes tracked the movement, but she did not move to block, and stepped out. The corridor was empty. The sodium light painted it in flat amber, no shadows deep enough to hide in. This was intentional. Hattori walked to the center of the passage, stopped, and turned to face the direction the patrol would come from. He placed his hands at his sides. Open, visible, The drone fragment in his sleeve was concealed but accessible. The notation, the scratched map, he had transferred to a flat piece of debris that fit in his palm. He stood and waited. The patrol arrived in 4 minutes, faster than expected. The cadence was tightening again. 4 figures in the dull carapace of Combine security equipment. The lead was the standard type, the mid-tier guard, the protocol follower, the one who would see a human standing in a corridor and reach for the containment tool because that was what the procedure manual said to do. The second and third were the same. The fourth, at the rear, was the slaver. The patrol lead raised a device, a rod-shaped tool that Hattori had seen used on 3 other humans in the holding bay. It delivered a shock that dropped a person to the floor. The lead pointed it at Hattori and spoke. The words were Combine language, incomprehensible, but the tone was unmistakable. Compliance instruction. Lie down. Submit. Be cargo. Hattori did not move. He watched the slaver. The slaver was watching him back. The patrol lead watched with the mechanical attention of someone executing a procedure. The slaver's eyes moved from Hattori's hands, open, visible, to his posture, balanced, deliberate, to his face, calm, waiting, and the slaver's head tilted 3 degrees to the left. Recognition, not of Hattori specifically, of the category. The slaver had seen this before, perhaps not in humans, but in some other cargo, some other harvest that had produced an individual who did not fight and did not submit, but instead chose. The slaver knew the difference between compliance and strategy because the slaver was, in his own register, a strategist. That was the tell Hattori had been waiting for. The patrol lead stepped forward. Hattori allowed himself to be restrained. The containment tool pressed against his shoulder and delivered its charge. The shock was significant, a hard jolt that locked his jaw and weighted his vision for 2 full seconds. But it was calibrated for something that wasn't him. The charge was meant to drop him, and it didn't. He staggered but stayed upright, and the patrol lead looked at the tool as if it had malfunctioned. It hadn't. It had performed exactly to specification. The specification was wrong. The slaver spoke, a short phrase directed at the patrol lead. The tone was authority, quiet, practiced, unargued. The patrol lead stepped back. The slaver moved to the front. He looked at Hattori for a long moment. Then he gestured, not with a weapon, but with an open hand, indicating a direction, a branching corridor, away from the patrol route. Standard protocol, Hattori imagined. High-value cargo. Someone who surrendered strategically was a management problem, not a containment problem. Received separate assessment. The slaver was following procedure, technically. He was separating a valuable specimen for individual evaluation. Hattori went where the slaver indicated. The alcove was a maintenance pocket, 3 walls of conduit housing, 1 open side facing a dead-end corridor, the same burnt sugar ozone smell. The light here was dimmer, filtered through a grill that separated this section from the main corridor system. The slaver stood at the open side, his back to the corridor. He had dismissed the patrol with a gesture. They had gone. He was alone with Hattori, and he was unafraid, and Hattori respected that. Fear would have made this harder. The slaver's composure meant he was thinking clearly, and a clear thinker could be shown the architecture of a problem. Hattori knelt, in presentation, not submission. He placed 3 objects on the floor between them. The first, the drone fragment. A maleficence of the machine the Norsemen had destroyed. I know what you sent. The second, the flat piece of debris on which Hattori had scratched the patrol route, the loop, the junction, the timing marks. He placed his fingertip on a position inside the route, the position where he had stood 40 minutes ago unseen. I know where they are. I was inside your perimeter and you did not see me. The third, a mark scratched directly into the floor, with the edge of the debris, the holding bay's position relative to the patrol route, and around it, small scratches indicating bodies, many bodies, more than the slaver's manifest said should be free. I know what you don't know I know. Hattori sat back on his heels. He placed his hands on his thighs. He waited. The slaver looked at the three objects. Lustisantages, through several phases, each legible despite the alienness of his features. Surprise came first, the brief widening of the structures around his eyes, the stillness of his jaw. Then calculation, the rapid back and forth between the patrol route diagram and the position mark, checking the geometry, understanding what it meant. Then something Hattori recognized across every species barrier he could imagine, because he had seen it on the faces of rival clan commanders in the moment they understood the battle was already over. Professional acknowledgement. You are claiming to be the most expensive problem I have encountered in 14 years of this work, the slaver said. Hattori did not understand the words. He understood the tone, the rueful cadence of a competent person confronting a situation that exceeded his operational parameters. Hattori had heard that tone from castle commanders who opened their gates, from arithmetic, not from fear. He responded the only way the situation allowed. He pointed to the patrol route diagram, then to himself, then to the position inside the route where he had stood. Then he tapped the diagram twice. I was there. You didn't know. The slaver looked at the diagram, looked at Hattori, looked at the drone fragment. The silence stretched. It was productive, the silence of a man whose calculations were arriving at a conclusion he had already suspected. Then the slaver reached for the communication device at his jaw. He spoke into it, 3 short phrases. The tone was authorization, not urgent, not panicked. Administrative, a redirect order. The patrol was being sent elsewhere, not disbanded, redirected. The slaver was not helping Hattori. He was choosing the interpretation of his own procedures that best served his own survival. He put the device down. His face, in that moment, belonged to a professional who had made the correct call and was already composing the report that would justify it. Cargo assessment indicated non-standard behavioral patterns. Patrol redirected to secondary containment zone pending evaluation. Recommend revised classification. He chose correctly, Hattori thought. Competent people usually do, when the cost of the wrong choice is made sufficiently clear. Hattori stood. He collected the drone fragment, his, earned, useful, and left the patrol route diagram on the floor. A gift. Let the slaver see what Hattori had seen. Let him understand the shape of the problem his institution had created by not looking closely enough. The slaver did not stop him from leaving. The corridor junction was empty. Hattori walked back along the route he had mapped, turned the last corner, and found the terrain reader exactly where he had left her. She was standing at the corridor mouth, her body angled to watch both approaches, and the patrol that had been visible in the far passage, the one she had been tracking for the last hour, was gone. She looked at the empty corridor, looked at Hattori. Her expression did not change. She was not a woman whose face announced her conclusions, but her eyes moved from Hattori to the direction the patrol had been, and then back, and she shifted her weight half a degree, the adjustment a person made when their assessment of someone nearby had just been revised. Hattori entered the staging area. The Roman was near the center, organizing a second rank of freed captives, and he looked up as Hattori passed. His gaze swept the corridor behind Hattori, empty, and then found the terrain reader at the junction. Where did he go? The Roman's words were in his own language, directed at the terrain reader with a look more than a voice, but the question was clear in any tongue. The terrain reader did not answer. She looked at the space where the patrol had been and let the absent speak. The young woman, the modern one, the one who understood the walls, was the only one who asked directly. She crossed to Hattori with the purposeful stride of someone who had decided that ignorance was worse than any possible answer. As she spoke in her own language, he did not understand the words, but he understood the question because it was written in the angle of her jaw and the set of her hands, and the fact that she was the only person in this group who would walk up to a man who had just done something inexplicable and demand an explanation she couldn't receive. He did not answer in any language she spoke. Instead, he looked past her, toward the next corridor, the one that led deeper into the ship, Toward cell blocks the group had not yet reached, toward walls that hummed with something other than recycled air, and raised an eyebrow. The question was clear enough. What is behind that wall? The PA cycled again. Aishe held still against the wall, close enough to the speaker grate that the vibrations tickled the fine hair on her temple. She did not lean into it. Leaning was movement, and movement meant the system might register her proximity as a behavioral event. She had learned that on the second day, or what she thought was the second day. Time was feeding cycles here, and she had counted 11. The announcement played, flat tones, that genderless machine voice, the same 12-word string it had been repeating at regular intervals since the alarm went quiet. She mouthed along, containment, secure, cycle, standard response, alert. The verb for move, it came in 2 conjugations, and she had spent 3 feeding cycles distinguishing them, one for cargo, one for personnel. The difference was a tonal shift on the second syllable, barely perceptible if you weren't listening for it. She was always listening for it. 40 words? She glanced down at the strip in her hand, a piece of cell-bed material she'd peeled free and flattened, scored with marks made by the sharp edge of a food packaging seal. 40 words arranged in clusters by function, nouns for things the ship cared about, verbs for things the ship did to those things, modifiers that seemed to indicate status or urgency. Containment, secure, cycle. The verb for move, it has 2 forms, one for cargo and one for personnel. I learned both. I am learning which one I am. The thought carried no bitterness. Bitterness was a luxury that required time and safety, and Aishe had neither. What she had was a strip of writing surface, a growing vocabulary, and a skill she'd carried since she was old enough to listen, older actually. She'd been listening before she had words for what she heard. Her mother's people moved through lands where 5 languages lived in the space of a day's walk, and the ones who survived were the ones who could hear the shape of a new tongue and start building inside it before the speaker finished the first sentence. The Combine's language was no harder than Hungarian. In some ways easier, it had been designed to be parsed by labor that was never meant to understand it fully. Simple grammar, repetitive structures, no poetry, no idiom, no wordplay. A language built for compliance. That was its weakness. The PA cycled again, same string. She caught a word she'd been uncertain about, manifest, or something close to it, a noun that appeared alongside the words for cargo and cycle and standard. She scored it onto her strip, adding a mark to indicate uncertainty. 41. The sound came through the wall, through the actual wall, the composite panel that formed the rear boundary of the holding bay. Aishe had been aware of it for some time. She didn't parse it mechanically, the way the young dark-skinned woman would have, reading frequency and resonance. But she didn't read it spatially, the way the woman with the watchful eyes would have, interpreting it as a change in terrain. Aishe heard it as a living thing. That breathing is not a human being, the rhythm is wrong, the depth is wrong. It has been there for a while. She pressed her palm flat against the panel. The composite was cool, slightly textured, and it conducted vibration better than it conducted heat. The breathing was deeper than anything in the holding bay. Longer inhale, longer exhale, a pause between cycles that no human lung would produce, too long, too even, as if the respiratory system had been designed for a thicker atmosphere or a slower metabolism. And there was a secondary rhythm underneath it, faint and regular, like a second pulse layered beneath the first. 2 systems, something with 2 respiratory systems, or 1 system and something else, a circulatory sound maybe, or a muscular rhythm she had no framework for. It had changed when the cell alarm went off. She was sure of it. The breathing had quickened, and then this was the part that mattered. It had slowed again, deliberately. Whatever was on the other side of this wall had heard the alarm, reacted, and then controlled its reaction. That was a thinking response. I moved along the wall, one hand trailing the surface, feeling for changes in the composite. The panel sections were uniform, gray, identical, sealed at the joints with a flexible gasket material that had the consistency of hardened resin. The construction was competent and old. Everything on the ship was competent and old. Built to last, built to contain, built by people who had stopped thinking about whether the design was optimal because it had worked for long enough that the question seemed irrelevant. Her fingers found the gap, lower than she expected, near the floor, at a joint where two panel sections met. The gasket had separated, or had never fully sealed, or had been worn away by the vibration of the ship's engines over however many years this vessel had been running its routes. The opening was perhaps 6 centimeters wide and ran horizontally for the length of her forearm, too narrow to crawl through, enough to see. She went to her knees, then flat on her belly, cheek against the cold deck, one eye pressed to the gap. The light was different. That was the first thing. A blue-green wash, cooler than the sodium orange of the human hold. The same institutional quality, the same flat industrial coverage, but a different spectrum, calibrated for different eyes. The Combine had bothered to adjust the lighting for its cargo, and the fact that it had done so had cared enough about optimal containment conditions to match the light to the species was somehow worse than if the holds had all been identical. It meant someone had filed a specification, someone had reviewed it, someone had approved the purchase order for different bulbs. The hold on the other side was larger than the human bay, or shaped differently, harder to tell from floor level through a 6-centimeter gap. The surfaces were the same gray composite, the same sealed joints, but the cell furniture was wrong. Too tall, too narrow, configured for bodies that did not sit the way human bodies sat. 3 figures. Aishe's breath caught, and she held it, and she watched. They were standing, or what passed for standing, given that their limbs articulated differently than hers. 3 joints in each leg where a human had 2, which gave them a stance that looked coiled, even at rest, like something perpetually ready to change direction. Their skin, if it was skin, caught the blue-green light and scattered it in iridescent patterns, dark scales that shifted through emerald and cobalt and deep bronze as they moved. Not feathers, not fur, something harder and more precise, like overlapping ceramic tiles that happened to be alive. Their heads were proportionally smaller than a human head, but their eyes were not. The eyes were large and segmented, not compound like an insect's, but sectioned like a kaleidoscope lens that had been divided into rings. Each ring seemed to focus independently. When the nearest figure turned its head, Aishe could see the rings adjusting, contracting, and expanding in sequence, and she understood with absolute certainty that it was looking at the gap. Looking at her, it had been looking at the gap before she had arrived. It had been waiting. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Aishe on her belly on the cold deck, one eye pressed to the gap, the figure on the other side, standing in its coiled spring posture, those segmented eyes tracking her with a precision that made the back of her neck prickle. Then one of the other 2 shifted, a lateral step, smooth and silent, and made a sound, low, tonal, with harmonics that suggested more than one vocal channel operating simultaneously. Their own language, not the Combine's. The nearest one answered without looking away from the gap. The same layered quality. A brief exchange, 2 sounds, a pause, 1 sound, then silence. Aishe understood none of the words. She understood all of the meaning. It's one of the others. It's watching us. What do? We wait. The hand is the right gesture. It is always the right gesture. An open hand, not a weapon, not a claim. That is all it is. She knew the thought was irrational. She knew that the gesture meant nothing to a species she had never seen before, from a world she couldn't name, with a physiology that might not even register the difference between an open hand and a closed one. Where she knew that, she also knew that her grandmother had walked into 6 different villages where her people were not welcome and had survived every one of them. And the first thing her grandmother did every time was show her open hands. Aishe slid her right hand through the gap. The composite edge scraped her wrist. The air on the other side was different, cooler, slightly more humid, carrying a faint scent that was mineral and sharp, like wet stone. Her hand emerged into the blue-green light, and she held it there, palm up, fingers open, completely still. Nothing happened. Her shoulder began to ache from the angle. The deck was cold against her chest. She could hear her own heartbeat, and underneath it, the alien breathing, closer now. The nearest figure had moved, and she couldn't see it because her eye was no longer at the gap. Her hand was occupying the space her eye had used. She held the position. Something touched her fingertips. A touch, light, exploratory, tracing the edge of her index finger from nail to first knuckle. The texture was smooth and hard and warm, like sun-baked clay, and there were too many points of contact for a 5-fingered hand. 6, maybe 7, each one articulating independently, mapping the shape of her hand the way a reader's fingers map a face. Then the grip closed. Firm, careful, something strong, choosing to be gentle. The fingers wrapped around her hand and held, and the pressure was even and deliberate, and Aishe felt the secondary pulse she'd heard through the wall, a slow, deep rhythm transmitted through the contact, alive in a way that was completely alien and completely recognizable. I am here. You are here. We are both here. She closed her fingers around the grip and held back. The vocabulary exchange took time. Aishe pulled her hand back, repositioned her eye at the gap, and began. She pointed at herself, said the Combine word for cargo. The nearest figure watched, then pointed at itself and repeated the word. Same pronunciation, slightly different tonal emphasis. They had learned it from different speakers or from different PA systems calibrated for different hearing. She said containment. They said containment. She said cycle. They said cycle. She said secure, and they said something different, a Combine word she hadn't cataloged, close to secure but with an additional modifier. She scored it onto her strip, 30 words on her side, roughly 30 on theirs. Different 30, but overlapping in the middle where the Combine's operational language was universal. 3 combined words from the other side. A pause, then 2 more. Root, she knew that one. Secure door. She knew both of those words separately, but hadn't heard them combined. The 3rd word, she didn't have it. She held up her hand, palm out. Again, they repeated. She shook her head. The figure tried a different construction. 2 words she did know, rearranged. Down, through, a root, a secure door, down and through. The floor, they were talking about a path through the floor. An access corridor, maybe, or an engineering sub-level that connected to their hold, but not to the human bay. She pointed down. They confirmed a single Combine affirmative that she recognized because the PA used it in containment status announcements. She pointed at the gap between them, at the wall. She used the Combine word for open. The response was immediate. All 3 of them, in unison, the same Combine word. Yes. Aishe rolled to her feet, brushed the deck line from her front, and walked back to where the others were staging. The broad man with the scarred arms was near the entrance, positioned where he could watch the corridor. The one with the soldier's bearing and the patient eyes stood with the woman who read spaces like landscapes, both of them studying the ceiling conduits. The thinker watched from near the wall, and his eyes tracked Aishe as she approached, and as she saw in his expression confirmation of a theory he'd already built. He had already suspected there were other cargo types. Aishe stopped in the middle of the group. She waited until they were looking at her, all of them, including the young dark-skinned woman who had been examining the cell mechanisms and now straightened up with a toolkit expression that Aishe recognized even across centuries and languages. What now? Aishe pointed at the wall. Alive, she said. 1 word, the first combined word she used deliberately with the group. The sound of it landed differently from the PA announcements. It came from a human throat, shaped by human intent, and every person in the bay understood it because the word carried its own translation in the way she pointed, in the direction of her gaze, in the weight of what she was telling them. She held up her strip. pointed at the wall again, used gesture, two hands, one human-shaped and one trying to approximate what she'd felt, the too many-fingered grip, the coiled posture. She traced the shape of the segmented eyes. She pointed down at the floor. Then she spoke directly, mixing gesture with the combine words she had and letting them carry what they could. I know about 30 of their words. They know about 30 of mine. It's enough to know they won out, and they know a door we don't. The soldier's eyes narrowed, tactical recalculation, visible and immediate. The thinker's chin dipped fractionally. The young woman stepped forward. Her voice was fast, direct, already building toward the next question before the current one was fully answered. What are they? Like what kind of? Are they dangerous? Kulful. Aishe looked at her. The question was practical and reasonable and came from genuine concern, and Aishe answered it the only way that mattered. Their cargo. The young woman's mouth opened, closed. She nodded once, and the nod contained an entire reorganization of assumptions. Then she was moving, crossing the bay to the wall, dropping to her knees, pressing her face to the gap. The blue-green light played across her features as she studied the other side, and Aishe watched her hands come up to frame the opening, fingers testing the panel edges, the gasket material, the structural join. The young woman's fingers found the panel strut, the load-bearing element that held the composite sections in alignment. She traced it, gripped it, looked at the fastening mechanism with the expression of someone who had just been handed a problem she was specifically built to solve. "This I can do," she said. She looked up at Aishe, then at the rest of them, and her hands were already on the strut, already calculating force and leverage, and the structural tolerance of composite that had been installed by workers who expected it to contain things less stubborn than this. Now this is going to be loud. 4 figures spread in a shallow crescent across the width of a passage, close enough to support each other, wide enough to funnel anyone who advanced into the center of their arc. The position invited you forward. When you advanced, it closed behind you. When it closed, you belonged to them. He had stood in this position at Chalco. He had stood in it at the edge of the causeways when the rains came. He had been on both sides, the one who advanced and the one who waited. He knew what this was, a flower war negotiation. Advance to take prisoners. The corridor is the field, the guards are the line, and the offer is the same as it has always been. Step forward, be taken, serve. The passage stretched ahead, 30 paces, maybe more. It was straight and wide enough for 4 men abreast, lit from above by flat panels that cast no shadow. The Combine had designed it the way they designed everything, for control. No alcoves, no pillars, no terrain, just a clean line of sight from one end to the other, and the certainty that anything moving through it was visible, countable, and contained. Behind Tigo, the group filled the junction where the corridor met a wider bay. 63 now, or close to it, the original 30-odd from the first holding bay, swelled by captives, freed from cells along the approach, humans of different builds and different centuries, and the scaled non-humans from behind the wall, their iridescent bodies catching the sodium light in flickers of green and copper. The injured moved in the center, supported by whoever was closest. The corridor ahead was the last passage. Beyond those 4 guards, the bridge, the tall one who thought in architecture, the one Tigo had begun to think of as the strategist, was reading the formation the same way Tigo was. The Tigre could tell from the angle of his head, the way his eyes moved from guard to guard, and then to the ceiling, then back. He was mapping intentions, not bodies. His conclusion would be political. They are offering terms, and the terms will close behind us. The broad Roman was reading it differently. His eyes went to the guards' spacing, their weapons, the width of the corridor. His conclusion would be military. 4 in a choke point, defensible, requires coordination to take. The young one, the modern one, was looking past the guards entirely. She was looking at the door behind them, at the faint glow of a status panel next to the frame. Her conclusion was structural. The bridge systems are on the other side of that door, and I need to reach them. All three were correct. None of them saw the part that mattered. Tigo saw it. They will not kill me. I am worth something to them alive. That is the same as armor, if you are willing to rely on it. He had done this calculation before, in the Flower War. He walked toward a line of warriors whose purpose was to capture, not kill. The weapons were real. The cuts were real. The blood was real. But the intent was containment. And if you understood the difference, if you could hold the shape of that difference in your mind while your body moved through violence, you could find the gap between what they were authorized to do and what you were willing to endure. These guards had the same constraint. He'd watched the Combine's responses through every corridor, every cell break, every confrontation. The weapons fired low-impact pulses. The containment devices restrained rather than killed. When a captive became difficult, the response was escalating restraint. Lethal force required authorization. Authorization came from the one in command, the pale spindly figure they had not yet reached. Behind that door, an authorization took time. The gap between their first shot and their authorization to kill is the only terrain I need. He felt the Roman's hand close on his forearm. The grip was firm and absolute. Wait, we assess. That was the hand's meaning. Tigo had learned to read the Roman's body the way he read ceremony, the economy of it, the precision. Every gesture meant one thing and one thing only. Tigo looked at the hand on his arm. He studied it for a moment. The knuckles were scarred in a pattern that spoke of decades of grip on wood and iron. A soldier's hand, calloused in the places that come from holding a shield, a hand that had held lines and formations and other men's courage in place. Then he looked at the corridor, then at the Roman. The expression Tigo offered was the face of a man who had already decided, perhaps the moment he saw the four guards standing the way men stand before an expected capture. There was nothing left to assess. The assessment was complete. He had done the arithmetic of his own value to the machine that held them, and the arithmetic was simple, and he was willing to bet his body on it. He lifted the Roman's hand off his arm, gently, the way you move a branch that has fallen across a path, without resentment, without force, with the understanding that it was simply in the way. The Roman's jaw tightened. He did not reach again. Tigo turned to the big Norseman, the one whose body filled corridors, whose hands had broken the first cell door open, the one who understood, Tigo suspected, what it meant to walk towards something on purpose. Nia, nikna mikuya mektin, mchu, I'm going, I'll meet you there. The Norsemen did not understand the words. Tigo watched his face and saw the moment when the tone landed, the way a good warrior reads intent through sound and stance, the way any human who has stood before battle reads the voice of a man who has chosen. The Norseman's shoulders dropped a fraction. Acknowledgement. He shifted his weight, opened a line to the corridor, and did not try to stop him. Tigo stepped into the passage. The light was different here, brighter, flatter, designed to eliminate hiding. The floor was smooth composite that absorbed the sound of his bare feet. The walls were featureless gray, occasionally broken by recessed panels that glowed the same amber as everything else on this ship. He could feel the air recyclers in the ceiling, the faint push of atmosphere against his skin. 30 paces, he walked at the pace of a procession. The stride of a man crossing a sacred space, because every space where you risk your body becomes sacred, whether the walls know it or not. This is the same as the Flower War, different flowers. At 20 paces, the guards reacted. Their weapons came up, stubby, dark instruments that Tigo had learned to recognize by their effect rather than their shape. The one on the far left shifted his weight forward, which meant he would move first. The one on the right was the steadiest, the one whose posture said, I have authority to decide. The two in the center were following protocol, which meant they were the least dangerous. They would do what their sequence told them, and the sequence was not built for this. Warning sounds filled the corridor, a flat, atonal pulse that repeated at 1-second intervals, accompanied by a voice from the ceiling, the same detached Combine language that the woman with the vocabulary had been learning. Status indicators on the wall panels shifted from amber to a deeper orange. The whole corridor was telling him to stop, in a language built for compliant cargo. Tigo did not stop. At 15 paces, the left guard fired. The pulse hit him center mass. He had been hit before, in the first corridor, in the cell break, twice in the approach through the lower decks. The sensation was a deep, full-body clench, every muscle contracting at once, as if the air had become a fist. His vision whited at the edges, his teeth slammed together. It hurt. It was designed to do no more than that. He kept walking. The second shot came from the center right. This one hit his shoulder and he felt the muscle seize from collarbone to elbow, felt his arm swing uselessly for 2 strides before the nerves released and function came back. He made no sound. The flower war taught you that the sound of pain was a weapon your opponent used against you. You kept it inside and let it fuel the next step. 10 paces, the guards were cycling through their protocols now. Tigo could see it in their body language, the jerky, sequential movements of beings running through a decision tree that had no branch for what if the cargo keeps walking. The one on the right, the decisive one, was speaking into a device on his wrist, requesting authorization. The authorization would come from the bridge, from the one in command, and it would take time because bureaucracies are the same everywhere. The form must be filled before the throat can be cut. That is the gap. That is all the terrain I need. He reached the left guard at 7 paces. The guard lunged with a restraint tool, a curved instrument that was supposed to lock around the limb and deliver escalating pulses until compliance was achieved. The design assumed the target would be slower, or more afraid, or would flinch at the first contact. Tigo did not flinch. He stepped inside the arc of the lunge, caught the guard's extended arm at the elbow, and redirected it downward with a sharp, controlled twist. The restraint tool discharged into the floor. The guard's body followed the torque, and Tigo helped it along, his knee finding the thing's midsection with the precision of a warrior who had been learning anatomy through impact since age 12. The guard folded. Tigo took the restraint tool and used it on the second guard before the second guard finished raising his weapon. The tool locked around the guard's forearm. The pulse fired. The guard staggered sideways and crashed into the wall panel, which cracked and went dark. The third guard had his weapon up and was trying to establish distance. Tigo closed the distance. There was no technique for what he did next. Or rather, the technique was so old and so practiced, it no longer had a name. A guard's weapon discharged into Tigo's chest from a hand's width away, and Tigo hit him with the discharge, absorbing the full body clinch while his momentum carried his shoulder into the guard's center mass and drove the guard backward into the sealed door. 3 down. 12 seconds, perhaps 15. The containment pulses sang through his muscles, residual contractions flickering across his ribs and abdomen like heat lightning. The fourth guard, the decisive one, the one with authority, stood 2 paces to the right of the door. His weapon was raised and steady. Vulcanor's device had gone silent. No response from the bridge. No authorization, no backup. Tigo looked at him. The guard looked at Tigo, the Cutigo as the burns already forming on his chest and shoulder, at the calm behind his eyes, at the 3 bodies on the floor. The guard was performing a calculation of his own now, one that had nothing to do with protocol stacks and everything to do with the arithmetic every being with a survival instinct performs when confronted with something the manual didn't cover. Tigo waited. He let the moment breathe. The guard lowered his weapon, stepped to the side, pressed his back against the wall, and did not move again. Tigo held the position. He stood at the near end of the cleared corridor, facing back the way he had come, while 63 people moved through the passage behind him. He heard their footsteps, bare feet and composite, the heavier tread of the Norseman, the careful clicking of the non-human segmented legs on the smooth floor. He heard the injured being helped along, the sounds of effort and pain. He heard the modern one say something to someone in a low, urgent voice and then say it again, and he heard the shakiness under her words that told him she was recalculating something she had believed about the world. He knew they wouldn't shoot him, she said. He knew. How did he know that? Idigo did not turn. He watched the corridor. 2 guards had repositioned, the first one he dropped and the decisive one, both now 40 paces back, standing in the wider bay where the group had gathered before. They had fallen to secondary protocol. Wait for backup. Tigo watched the decisive one. He let the guard see that he was being watched. The guard did not advance. The people moved through, the young, the old, the scaled aliens who smelled like dry copper and moved with careful, articulated precision. A Meikio Eno and a broken arm cradled against his chest, a woman carrying a child whose eyes were closed. The non-humans moved in a loose cluster, their kaleidoscope eyes tracking everything, their triple-jointed legs carrying them with a strange, folding grace. The last one through was one of the non-humans, smaller than the others, moving carefully, favoring one leg. It paused near Tigo and turned one of its segmented eyes toward him. The eye shifted through a series of focal patterns, like a lens adjusting. Tigo met its gaze. The alien made a sound, a low harmonic that vibrated in the floor, and moved on. Tigo released the position. He did not check if anyone was grateful. He did not look for acknowledgement. He walked to the bridge door and stopped in front of it. The surface was dark composite, inset with a status panel that pulsed soft amber. Everyone else had moved past him, crowding the wider space before the door, but Tigo stood close enough to touch it. A Buddha's head, hima panolti no nenzin, ma hikma ma kilti in campa non yaus, amo nima mauhutia. 3 words worth of meaning, spoken quietly to someone who was not there. Someone who had been dead before the light took him, or dead long before that, or alive only in the space Tigo kept behind his ribs, where the sacred and the tactical had never been separate things. He did not translate, he did not explain. He looked up at the door. Behind him, the woman with the vocabulary, the one who learned languages the way rivers learn landscapes, was kneeling beside the status display panel. Her lips moved as she matched glyphs to her growing lexicon. Her expression shifted. Something in the display was wrong, or unexpected, or both. She looked at the strategist. The strategist looked at the modern one. The modern one came forward. She crouched beside the display, her eyes scanning the readouts with the focus of someone who understood systems even when the language was alien. Her brow furrowed, then it smoothed, then it furrowed again, deeper. His backup, she said. Her voice was very quiet. It was redirected 42 minutes ago. A pause. The corridor hummed. He's been negotiating empty-handed for 40 minutes. She looked at the door. He doesn't know. The bridge door opened the way a cell door had opened 4 hours ago. Mechanical, indifferent, the ship not caring who passed through. Deka came through third, behind the Roman and the Norseman, and the first thing she registered was how small the room was. Small like a cockpit, a place built for work and nothing else, which meant she understood it immediately because every functional space she had ever operated in, the generator shacks outside Mogadishu, the relay stations, the field clinics with their plastic sheeting and zip-tied cable runs, looked exactly like this. Tasked lighting, console stations arranged in a rough horseshoe, status displays mounted at eye height for someone taller than human. The hum of the ship's systems was louder here, or maybe just less filtered, the vibration coming up through the deck plates and into the bones of her feet. The captain was at the central station. He turned. Deka had been expecting, she wasn't sure, weapons, rage, the cornered animal mathematics of a man with nothing left. What she got was a face she recognized from 100 checkpoint interactions and 3 years of NGO fieldwork, the expression of a mid-level official whose scheduled meeting had been replaced by an unscheduled meeting, and who was processing the change with the weary professionalism of someone whose day was already ruined before this happened. Ike's tall. All the Combine crew were tall. longer limbs, narrower build, skin that caught the sodium light with a faint mineral sheen. His uniform was the same dull gray-green as every other combined surface, and it fit him the way a uniform fits someone who has worn it for decades, perfectly, without any evidence of a body underneath. He looked at them the way a harbor official looks at a ship that has docked in the wrong berth. He spoke English. Deka didn't understand most of it. The language-learning woman would. She was already moving forward. Her head tilted at the angle Deka had learned meant, "I'm catching about 70% of this," but the tone was unmistakable. Administrative, procedural, the tone of someone opening a meeting they expected to chair. The Norseman filled the doorway behind her. The Roman stepped to the left and stood still, which was what the Roman did when he was reading a room. He became a wall with eyes. The Japanese man came through next, his gaze moving in a pattern Deka had seen on exactly one other person in her life, a former intelligence officer who'd worked with her team outside Baidoa. Threat assessment, sightlines, power structure, exits, all of it mapped in the time it took to cross a threshold. The burned man, the Mexica, came through last. He leaned against the wall by the door with the careful economy of someone whose body was informing him in specific detail about the cost of the last hour. The burns on his forearms were still livid. They didn't seem to notice them. Deka stopped looking at people and started looking at systems. She couldn't help it. The compulsion was older than fear, deeper than strategy, the thing that had made her good at field work and terrible at staying safe. The generator shacks had been the same way. Walk into a new space, name everything, build the map. She moved to the nearest console and didn't touch it, just read. Navigation, there's the star, there's us, that line is our heading and we're moving. The display was alien, obviously. The notation system was nothing she'd seen. But the logic was the logic of every navigation interface she'd ever worked with. Because navigation was navigation. You were somewhere, you were going somewhere else, and the system needed to tell you how fast and in what direction. The Combine had solved that problem the way every civilization would solve it. A positional display, a vector indicator, a destination marker. Life support threshold were near it, not critical. The second console was environmental. She could read the gradient bars even without understanding the units, green ranges, amber warnings, the same visual language as a fuel gauge. The ship was running inside its margins. Tight but functional, comms array there, third console, communications, active channels, dormant channels, a log of recent transmissions that scrolled in a script she was beginning to recognize from the cell block announcements, the captain's official channel, a secondary channel tagged with a different auth signature, a maintenance band, and she stopped. And this is a redirect order 40 minutes ago. That's not the captain's auth code. The display showed it clearly. A recovery team, she could read the force disposition format because it looked like every logistics manifest she'd ever parsed had been en route to this ship. Standard response to a compliance event, she assumed, the captain's call for backup, and 40 minutes ago, someone with a different authorization code had rerouted that team to a secondary waypoint. The order was clean, efficient, followed through proper channels. She read it twice. Then she understood. Deka looked across the bridge. The Japanese man was watching her. He was already watching her. His expression hadn't changed, it never changed, but the angle of his attention told her he knew what she'd found because he had known it was there to find. The deal with the cargo specialist, the redirect, the empty hand. He'd stripped the captain's position out from under him 40 minutes ago, and the captain didn't know. Between them, the negotiation was happening. The language-learning woman stood between the Japanese man and the captain like a human switchboard, her body angled so she could see both faces. Her hands were moving unconscious gesture work of someone processing two streams of meaning simultaneously. She would listen to the captain speak, catch the Combine words she knew, fill in the gaps from tone and context, then turn to the Japanese man and convey the meaning through a combination of the 30-odd shared Combine words they'd all absorbed and a gesture vocabulary that had grown more sophisticated every hour. The captain's offer came through her in pieces. Deka heard the combine words she recognized: categorization, assignment, non-standard, and watched the language-learning woman's face as she assembled the meaning. Then the woman turned to the group and spoke, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who knows she is the only bridge between two worlds. The captain had offered them reclassification. "I can offer reclassification," the woman translated, her intonation flat and precise, rendering the captain's bureaucratic cadence faithfully. "Non-standard working assignment. You would not be cargo." Deka felt the words land in her chest. A better category. Still a category. The Roman hadn't moved. He stood where he'd been standing since he entered. Left side of the horseshoe, weight evenly distributed, hands empty. He looked at the captain with the absolute, unhurried patience of a man who had watched an empire enter its late period and understood with professional clarity what late periods looked like. He spoke two words, Latin. Deka didn't understand them, but the language-learning woman did, or understood enough, because she turned to the captain and said them in Combine. "We are not cargo." The captain heard the distinction. Deka could see it register, a flicker behind the professional mask, an awareness that the frame he was operating in had just been rejected. He had offered them a better category. The Roman had rejected the existence of categories. The captain's protocols did not have a next step for this. He looked at the Roman. The Roman looked back. The silence lasted 3 seconds. It felt geological. Deka used those 3 seconds. She moved back to the comms console and pulled up the redirect order again, checking the timestamp against the ship's internal clock. 42 minutes. The recovery team had been rerouted 42 minutes ago, and the captain had spent those 42 minutes negotiating as if help was on the way. She leaned close to the Japanese man. He was 2 meters away, positioned where he could see both the captain and the door. She pitched her voice low. "His backup has been redirected. He doesn't know he's been negotiating empty-handed for." She checked the timestamp again. 42 minutes. The Japanese man's expression didn't change, but his chin dipped a fraction, a nod so minimal it was almost a thought. He looked at the language-learning woman. The language-learning woman looked at Deka. The question was in her eyes. "Are you sure?" Deka stepped back to the console and pointed. The display was right there. The redirect order, the auth code that wasn't the captain's, the recovery team's current position, light hours away and moving in the wrong direction. She read the numbers aloud, and the language-learning woman's lips moved as she processed them into Combine. Then the woman turned to the captain and told him the numbers, the redirect timestamp, the current position of his recovery team, the fact that no standard response was en route and hadn't been for 42 minutes. She delivered it the way Deka had seen experienced translators deliver bad news to officials in the field, clearly, precisely, without editorial. The information was the weapon. Commentary would have dulled it. The captain's face when the information landed was the worst thing Deka had seen on this ship, and she had seen people pulled from their lives and locked in cells by beings who didn't remember doing it. He wasn't a monster. She could see that now, clearly, in the sodium light of his own bridge. He was a man who had had a schedule. He had run this route 47 times. She'd seen the log count on the navigation display, and every one of those 47 runs had proceeded within parameters. The cargo was loaded. The cargo was delivered. The cargo was not his problem after delivery. He had never been the one who decided what happened to them. He was the freight driver, not the slaughterhouse. And now his own company had cut his phone line, and he was standing in a room full of cargo that had learned to say no, and the machine he had served for 47 runs had not sent anyone to help him. "How long have you been watching us?" he said. The language-learning woman translated it. Very quiet. He actually wanted to know. Nobody answered, because the answer, since the moment you put us in cells built for creatures that were not what we are, was not a thing any of them could have articulated even if they'd shared a language. The Norseman didn't speak because speaking wasn't what the Norseman did. The Roman didn't speak because the Roman had already said the only thing that needed saying. The Japanese man didn't speak because silence after a question like that was louder than any answer. The captain stood in that silence for a long moment. Then he reached for his communication device, a slim, dark surface thing mounted at his station. The movement was automatic, the gesture of a man who had failed 47 end-of-run reports, and whose hand knew the motion before his mind had decided to make it. He activated the device. Voice logging. The ship's system acknowledged with a soft tone. Cargo non-compliant, the captain said. His voice was level, professional, a man completing his paperwork. Requesting recovery at nearest station. Please advise. He put the device down. The bridge was quiet. The ship hummed. The sodium lights buzzed at a frequency just below hearing, the way they had buzzed in every corridor and cell and holding bay for every hour since Deka had woken up in a world that was not hers. Nobody advised. The captain looked at the device for a moment, as if expecting the response that had always come before. The response that had come 47 times, reliably, because the Combine was a machine, and machines responded when you filed the correct form. Then he stepped back from his station. It was the motion of a man clocking out. His shift was over. The manifest was no longer his problem. His report, whatever happened next, was above his pay grade, and the people above his pay grade had rerouted themselves 42 minutes ago. He moved to the side of the bridge and stood there, a cog without a machine. They settled into the bridge the way water settles into a container, finding levels, filling space, each body moving to the position that made structural sense without anyone directing it. The tracker, the woman who read spaces the way a hunter reads terrain, moved to the navigation display's peripheral monitors. Terrain, approaches, the ship's surroundings rendered as data she couldn't read yet, but was already parsing by shape and rhythm, the way she'd parse a ridgeline or a river system. Her fingers hovered over the display without touching, mapping. The Norseman put himself at the entrance. He was the entrance. The door was open behind him, and beyond it the corridor where 63 freed people, human and not human, waited in the uncertain quiet of people who had heard the fighting stop and didn't yet know what that meant. He filled the frame the way a lintel fills a doorway, structural. The Japanese man was at the captain's former station, studying the display architecture without touching the controls. He wasn't interested in the technology. He was interested in what the technology revealed about who reported to whom, who could authorize what, where the pressure points were. Clan politics, the same logic in different light. The language-learning woman had moved to the center of the horseshoe, equidistant from everyone. She stood very still, her eyes half closed, and Deka realized she was listening to the ship, not the mechanical hum, the informational hum. The PA system, the automated status updates, the constant low-grade data stream of a vessel talking to itself. She was absorbing it the way she'd absorbed everything, patiently, precisely, building a vocabulary, one word at a time. The burned man had not moved from his spot by the door. His eyes were open, his breathing was controlled and slow, the discipline of someone managing pain through will alone. The burns on his forearms had begun to blister, and the language-learning woman would need to look at those soon, but not yet. The Roman stood where he'd been standing, peasant, present, the wall with eyes watching a room organize itself around the thing they had done, cataloging every position, every role, every strength. When a legion made camp, there was a moment exactly like this, the defenses set, the perimeter established, the interior not yet organized but contained. He knew this moment. He lived in this moment. The fact that the camp was a stolen alien vessel instead of a hilltop in Pannonia was, from a structural standpoint, a minor variation, and Deka was at the navigation display. The galaxy map filled the forward well of the bridge, a projection that rose from the console like a holographic terrain model, stars rendered as points of light with data tags in a script she was beginning to recognize but couldn't read. Waypoints, trade routes, combine administrative designations. The map of an empire that had been harvesting species from planets like hers for 10,000 years, and somewhere in that map, somewhere in that dense alien cartography, was a star with a small rocky planet third from center, with one large moon and 7 billion people who didn't know any of this was happening. She couldn't find it. The realization settled slowly, heavy. She had known since she'd first looked at the display. Earth's position in this cartography was a needle in a haystack, rendered in a language she didn't speak, tagged with a designation she didn't know, filed under a threat classification that hadn't been updated in 400 millennia. Boa Centaur 7, negligible, not even worth a current entry. The light of the map played across her face, blues and golds in faint amber of tagged waypoints. Behind her she could feel them, all of them, the living weight of people who had done the impossible thing and were now standing in the silence after it. And then the bridge door, in the corridor, 63 others, human and not human, freed from cells that hadn't been built to hold them, waiting. I don't know what any of these stars are. The thought was clear and steady and terrified. I don't know what direction is home. I know what every system on this bridge does, and I know how to make the ship go somewhere. She put her hands on the console. The surface was warm. The ship hummed through her palms, alive and ancient and indifferent to who was steering. That's enough for now. That's enough. Okay, Deka said. Behind her, no one asked what she meant. They knew.